was formerly with the Michigan Nonprofit Association. I was there for about 10 years as public policy director. And then about 2 years ago, I had my son, and so I went off to do some contract work for various different organizations. And one of my clients is the Center for Lobbying and the Public Interest, which I'll talk about in a second. So our outline for the session today is going to be, we're going to talk about the rules and regulations related to lobbying, and we're going to talk about some simple tactics on how you can be an advocate. I always like to start out these trainings with, talking about a little bit in terms of why we should do advocacy. And it's really not a question of should we do advocacy, but really a question of can we afford not to. And the example that I always like to give is a homeless shelter. A homeless shelter is going to continue to provide beds year after year, probably providing more beds as the economy gets worse. They're just kind of spinning their wheels, unfortunately, trying to serve more and more people. And that's going to continue to happen until they address the root causes of homelessness. And the root causes of homelessness, poverty, maybe it's looking at fair wage, all the affordable housing, etc. Until they address those issues, those root causes, which are public policy issues, which we're going to discuss in a second, that organization is never truly going to be able to meet its mission of serving the homeless. It has to address those root causes, which has a public policy angle to it. And how do we affect public policy? Through advocacy. So the IRS rules and regs for lobbying. Anyone ever been told, by the way, that C3s can't lobby? Oh, good. So with the 501c3 public charities, we have these rules and regulations related to lobbying. But if you take nothing out of this session, I hope that you will at least take this out of here, which is that absolutely public charities can lobby. It's just a matter of knowing how much we can do, because we're just limited in terms of the amount of money that we can spend, and then also just knowing what we have to report. But you'll have to actually find out that it's pretty simple. And I am going to talk first about public charities, which includes the traditional organizations that you probably all work with, as well as community foundations. And then I will also touch on private foundations at the end. Mm-hmm. Sound good? So, a couple of definitions that I want to, first talk about. Public policy is really the goals, the rules, the funding priorities that are set by public officials, right? Advocacy is pretty simple. It's this umbrella term that involves identifying, embracing, and promoting a cause, right? And how do we impact public policy? Through advocacy. Lobbying is a very specific form of advocacy, very narrowly defined, that involves influencing legislation. There's a lot of stuff that you do in the advocacy arena that isn't specifically about a piece of legislation. So we'll talk about how really narrowly defined lobbying actually is. This shows the various different tactics, right? So these are the different things, the tools in your shed in terms of how you would identify, embrace, and promote a cause to impact public policy, okay? So you've got organizing a rally, you've got educating policymakers, you've got meeting with policymakers, you've got research, you've got training, the whole shebang, right? You also have lobbying in there, because lobbying is an advocacy tactic. You'll notice, though, that it turns out orange on the screen. It's meant to be yellow. Lobbying has a yellow there because it's not a stop, it's just a yield. So let's yield and just take a second and just learn about how much lobbying you can do and what you have to report, okay? So you can still absolutely do it. We're just talking about what are the rules related to it. So you absolutely can lobby. What you want to think about is something called the H election, okay? It's this one-page form that if C3s file, it can make your life significantly easier because it talks about exactly how much you can spend on these lobbying efforts. And again, this is just a reminder that it includes community foundations as we're going through. So just as a poll, how many of you have actually filed the H election? Or know if you have? You know what? If you haven't, that's okay. Or if you don't know if you have, that's okay, because you can still just file it again. And actually what we find is that less than 2% of nonprofits actually file the H election, which means a couple things to me. Either one, that fewer organizations are actually advocating and lobbying, or two, organizations just aren't necessarily reporting, or three, organizations just don't know about the H election. And the H election really, again, just simply says what is lobbying, how much you can spend on lobbying, and the kind of the do's and don'ts, if you will. With the lobbying rules and regs, you have this crazy thing called the substantial part test, and then you have the expenditure test, which is the same thing as the H election, okay? So if you do not file this H election that I mentioned, you're bound by the substantial part test, because that's the default, according to the IRS, okay? The bummer about the substantial part test is that it doesn't clearly say how much you can spend on lobbying, so how much you can spend on trying to influence legislation. Some case law has said maybe it's 5% of your budget, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 20%, but it's not clearly defined anywhere, okay? Whereas with the expenditure test, the H election, it clearly says exactly how much you can spend based on your annual expenditures. It clearly defines what is lobbying, and it clearly defines what are exemptions to lobbying. The H election, the expenditure test, is really simple to file. It's a one-pager that all you really do is put your name on there, the organization's name, sign it, and ship it off to the IRS. Again, if you don't know if your organization has sent it in, you can just go ahead and send it in again. That's okay. It really is that simple. Under the H election, or the expenditure test, this is the breakdown in terms of how much money you can spend on lobbying. And again, lobbying is only one tactic of advocacy, right? So as a 501c3 public charity, if you have filed your H election, this is the maximum that you can spend on your lobbying activities, okay? So it's 20% of the first $500,000 of annual expenditures. It's 15% of the next $500,000, 10% of the next $500,000, up to $1 million, okay? So it actually is a pretty generous amount in terms of the amount that you can spend on your lobbying efforts. There have been efforts nationally to actually increase this amount to be more than $1 million, because frankly, $1 million isn't what it used to be. Unfortunately, there's not as much, there's not as much support in the sector right now for doing 50? That. Okay. Now, what's difficult is that with the nonprofits, you can only spend a quarter of that total lobbying budget actually on grassroots lobbying, which I'll define in a second. So there's direct lobbying and there's grassroots lobbying. You have direct lobbying, which is when you are directly interacting with an elected official, asking him or her to vote for a specific piece of legislation. This can be local, state, and federal. And then you would also have your the grassroots lobbying, which is when you would be reaching out to the public, asking them to contact an elected official to vote for or against a piece of legislation. The example of the ABC charity, because I'm not good at math, is that the ABC charity has expenditures of $250,000. Say 20% of the $250,000, which is $50,000, right? You can spend on direct lobbying, which is again my interacting directly with the elected official, urging him or her to vote for or against a piece of legislation, right? And then you can spend 25% of that $50,000, which is your lobbying budget, which is $12,500 on grassroots. And again, that's me reaching out to the public, encouraging them to contact an elected official to vote for or against a piece of legislation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So, what is direct? Direct is, and I'm going to say to Chris, Senator Chris, which I hope you run for office someday.
Maybe I will.
Yeah, maybe you will, good. Senator Chris, I urge you to vote for Senate Bill 123, and this is why. That's direct lobbying. That would apply if I did it if he was a state representative, state senator, or on the national level, congressional delegation, or on the local level, your city council or your county commission, okay? Grassroots is when you would urge the public, so I'm saying, Christina, I urge you to contact Senator Chris and urge him to vote for Senate Bill 123, and this is why, and this is how you contact him. That's grassroots lobbying. Okay? You could do that via the media, you could do that via letters to people, whatever you want, whatever, calling, writing, visiting. But that's the grassroots part, when you're reaching out to the public, asking them to contact the elected official. Got it? Does that make sense? So the only reason that you need to know the difference between direct and grassroots lobbying is because when you're reporting on the 990, you have to say how much you're spending in the aggregate on your direct lobbying and how much you're spending on your grassroots lobbying. That's really the only reason that you need to know the difference. In terms of what isn't lobbying, and this applies only to the H election folks, self-defense is not included. You don't have to count those in your lobbying expenses. The self-defense is when you're having challenges to your tax exempt status, right? That would be an example of self-defense. Another example of what isn't lobbying is nonpartisan research and analysis. And so that would be if you have research that isn't specifically talking about, you're not saying in the research that you urge people to vote for or against a specific piece of legislation. You're instead just saying this is the policy issue and this is what you should know about it, okay? The other piece is written technical assistance regarding legislation. And this would be if, so take for the state house or the state senate, for example, again, this applies local, state, or federal, they actually send you a written request, an email, snail mail, whatever, that asks you to come and testify at a committee hearing. You can go and testify at the committee hearing, and that actual testimony and the time that it took to prepare you and the mileage to get you there does not count as lobbying expenses because they asked you to do it. Same thing if they'd asked you to write a letter or if they had asked you to actually come in person to another venue other than actually testifying, same thing applies. It's because they were asking you to do so. Another piece is general communication with the legislature or the public that doesn't apply specifically to asking them to take a position on a specific piece of legislation. You're just generally talking about policy issues, education. You're generally talking about how important food stamps are. You're generally talking about how important, looking at affordable housing is, etc. But you're not specifically talking about a piece of legislation and asking them to take a position on it. That is not actually lobbying. Okay, so there's an awful lot. And the other piece that's not lobbying is actions that are affects regulatory issues. And this is when, so for example, a bill passes, right? And then it goes to a department to be implemented. Well, once it's at the department level to be implemented, they'll look at different regulatory pieces to it, right? So you can be lobbying to your heart's content, the departments, and none of that counts towards your lobbying expenses. Okay? Again, this is under the H election. Any questions on the public charities? Yeah.
I have a couple questions. One of the things in where it talks about substantial versus expenditure, it talks about a violation underneath the substantial part. So how will you know what you violated if you have not filed an H election?
Right, so how would you know if you've gone over the substantial amount? Right. Yeah, that's a huge problem, which is why you should just file the H election. But the IRS, probably they'd say facts and circumstances, right? That's always an attorney's favorite thing to say. So facts and circumstances, they would determine that you have gone over probably a 20%, mark. And but to be honest with you, the IRS, isn't sitting there waiting for organizations to do that. I very rarely have actually heard of them going after organizations for that. But if you file the H election, the beauty of it is that you have that safe harbor exemption, okay? So if you go over the amount that you can spend 1 year, right, in terms of what your lobbying budget is, that next year you just decrease the amount that you spend. So say you go over by $20,000 the first year, that second year you just decrease your spending on lobbying by $20,000 and you call it good. So that's pretty nice. Yeah.
Does the lobbying expenditure include actually having a public policy staff person? Is that considered part of that budget? Or
well, it depends if they're lobbying. So it would only be the time that they spend lobbying that would count towards the lobbying budget. Does that make sense?
So that staff person would actually have to track the time they were spent doing different tasks.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, and what I always recommend is that with your timesheets, you would have one line item that is direct lobbying and one line that is grassroots lobbying. So that every week you just count the number of, you put 3 or 4 hours, whatever you're doing under each. And then at the end of the year, your accounting group or whatever can be able to look back and say, okay, this is what this is what your hourly pay would come out to.
Okay.
So this is what you would have been, this is what we should count as an expenditure for lobbying efforts. So we talked about public charities, and in public charities that also includes community foundations, right? So everything that I just said involves community foundations. The other beautiful thing about community foundations is that they can also, in addition to supporting advocacy efforts, they can also earmark grants for lobbying. And they may choose not to, but they legally can. Now, private foundations are in a little bit of a different situation. They can advocate, so all the stuff that we had listed on that chart, but they can't lobby unless it's a self-defense issue, okay? Now, what they can do, however, is private foundations can fund advocacy efforts, but they can't earmark grants for lobbying, okay? But they could support your lobbying efforts in programmatic grants or in your general support grants, which is why general support grants, one of the many reasons general support grants are so desired and so needed in the sector. Does that make sense? Now, you might end up with a private foundation that has an agreement letter that says that you can't lobby. And there have been efforts by COF, which is the Council on Foundations, Independent Sector, Alliance for Justice, you name it, of groups that are trying to ask foundations to take that out of their agreement letters because they don't legally need it in there. But I encourage you, if you see it in your, in the letter, your agreement letter, I encourage you to have a conversation with your program officer about what that means. The tactics in terms of, how you want to think about preparing your organization to do this work. The first is looking at your organization internally. And you want to make sure that you're connecting your policy work. Again, so you're looking at doing advocacy, identifying, embracing, promoting a cause, specifically to influence public policy, right? And to do that, you want to make sure that you're tying it to your mission. So tying it to the people that you serve, just like I did with the homeless shelter earlier, right? Tying it to the people that you serve or the resources that you protect. It's always critical to do that mission connection. You also want to think about preparing your board of directors. You want to have the conversation with, have we filed the H election? What type of policy should we become involved in? Your organization might want to think about coming up with a policy statement that says, these are the types of policy issues that we will get involved in. These are the types of things we will take positions on, or come up with some position statements as well that help to guide the staff and others that work with you to know what type of issues you're going to get engaged with. So have those conversations with your board. The other thing you might want to think about is really just studying the legislative process. So, you've all heard, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill, right? But it's totally true, right? And that really is how the process works. And so you want to be able to actually really look at just how does a bill become a law. And you can look at that from the legislative perspective, because they do have all this information on their websites, as well as I think M&A still has it on there, for example, on the state level. But also think about how your elected officials can be resources for you. And they can really be resources in terms of how the legislative process works. You are the experts in terms of your policy issues, right? The legislators and their staff are the experts in how the process works. And so definitely use them or have them help you to understand how the process works. The other piece is just create a who's who list, which is really just thinking about within your board, having a conversation of who do they know? Who are the elected officials that they know? Helping to use, it's that, kind of that social networking perspective, right? Social network mapping. Looking at who are the people that they know that can help to connect you with the elected officials as well. The other thing is you want to just think about becoming a voice for your cause. So building a public presence, which is simply, maybe you're not ready to testify at a committee hearing, but go to a committee hearing. Just make sure your presence is known. Go to a coalition meeting. You can join a coalition meeting, join a coalition, and maybe not have a huge role in it, but you could still play a role, because everyone in a coalition has a different role, right? There are some who take more of a leadership position, and there are some who just lend their support and, try to educate people about the issues. That's okay. So consider becoming a part of a coalition. Also think about becoming a reliable source of information, which is basically, think about going to your legislator's office or elected official's office and saying, hi, I'm with the Schools Foundation. This is what we do. This is how we might be of assistance to you. If you ever have any questions related to this in education, I'm happy to help you. The idea is to be able to become a resource for them versus just always going to ask them for something. The other piece is build relationships with policymakers. You can pretty easily do this by putting them on your mailing list, by going to visit them and visiting them at their offices, but as well as think about their coffee hours. Especially state legislators, they have coffee hours that nobody shows up to. So go and meet with them. They'd love that. They'll remember who you are forever. And you can also think about inviting them out to your organization. You know, it's one thing for people to hear about something, it's completely something different for them to be able to see something. And when they actually see it, it means something different. I always tell, food banks, for example, invite your elected officials out on the days that you know you're going to be running low on food. You know you're going to be, that time of month where you're going to have a lot of people there and you're going to be having issues with food, so that they can actually see who the people are who are coming in to get the food, to help break down some of maybe their misunderstandings, as well as understand the need that's out there and your supply and demand. The other piece is think about how you could maybe a lot of groups have volunteer recognition events. You could think about recognizing elected officials. They love that, give them a certificate and a photo op, and that means a lot to them, just like it means a lot to anyone. Then think about educating your publics, which is educating your staff, your donors, your volunteers, people in your community. Just educate them on the policy issues that you care about. Include information in your newsletters. Think about doing sessions on policy issues at your trainings or at your conferences. Invite people in to participate in coalition meetings. Just educate the people that you work with. Then you want to increase and sustain your advocacy. And what this simply is know the staff. So get to know the policymaker staff. The staff can be your absolute best friends. They're the ones who are writing the bills. They're the ones who control the schedules. You want to make sure that you're friends with them. Call, write, and visit. And that means calling them to lobby on an issue, writing them, and visiting them. If you do all three, that can be most successful. Build your grassroots army. So think about, again, your donors, your volunteers, your staff, all the people in your community who might be interested in this issue, and help to engage them. Give them an action in addition to educating them. Build relationships with the media. Just like we talked about building relationships with policymakers, go out to coffee with them. Very few reporters now have beats anymore, right? So again, you are the expert. You could offer, hey, if you have a question, regarding, if it's regarding housing, affordable housing, for example, give me a call. I'm happy to help you. I'm happy to help you walk through that. They love that, and they will call you for that. And then you also become a source for them on your stories, which is what you want. The other piece is provide opportunities for policymakers. And this is, again, inviting them to your events, providing opportunities for them to speak, all of that kind of jazz, so that you're actually bringing them into your organization's fold, just like you do with your donors and your volunteers, etc. So it's actually pretty simple tactics that you can do. We're going to skip this because we're running out of time. And so just in summary, again, file your H election. Remember that you absolutely can lobby. It's just a matter of what you have to report. It's not a big deal. It's just what you're reporting on your 990. And then start thinking about these basic advocacy tactics if you haven't already started to do these. A couple of resources. There's the Clippy website that has a great deal of resources on, again, the IRS rules, but then also on how to be an effective advocate. And then the Alliance for Justice has a lawyer hotline that's 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, that you can call and ask them. A lawyer will answer, and you can ask them questions. Do I count this as lobbying? Do I not count this as lobbying? What about, I'm thinking about getting involved in voter engagement. Can you help me think through this? Are we okay with these types of activities? So they're there to help you as well. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
In terms of community foundations, do they, if they are able to make grants that support lobbying efforts, what are they then governed by the same rules?
Correct.
In terms of, so it can't be more than a certain percentage of their
Right.
granting budget.
Yeah.
Their organizational budget.
Of their lobbying budget, right. So what they would have to do is then, so they would go through the same calculation, assuming they're an H elector, right? Go through the same calculation and say they had $50,000, which is their lobbying budget, right? If they gave a grant out for $50,000, which you wouldn't love that, if they gave a grant out for $50,000 specifically earmarked for lobbying, that would be their entire lobbying budget for the year. So they have to count the grant against their lobbying budget. Does that make sense?
Well, but here it's not 20% of your lobbying budget, it's 20% of your annual expenditures, as I understand.
Right. But once you make that calculation, you then determine what your lobbying budget is.
Right.
So your lobbying budget based off of your annual expenditures. After you've done that calculation, you say you have $50,000 that you can spend on lobbying.
Right.
What are some examples of, Because when you think of lobbyists, kind of alluded to it earlier in terms of there's this sketchy, idea of this greasy guy, taking the politician out for dinner.
Right.
So what is, can you paint a picture for us in terms of what proper direct lobbying is? So as a nonprofit that's interested in doing some direct lobbying, what does that look like in a legal, ethical, moral kind of point of view?
Sure. It's, calling the legislator's office, making an appointment, saying that you want to come in and, you happen to have, maybe you're thinking about who you're going to bring with you. So when you're thinking about who you're going to bring with you, think about, does anyone on your board have a relationship with that legislator? Take them with you. Say, this is who I'm going to bring. This is what we would like to talk to the legislator about. Show up on time. When you get there, stick to your talking points and, accomplish what you want, and ask them to support or oppose, specific bill that you're working on perhaps. And then ask them for some level of commitment related to that. Are they willing to oppose it? Are they willing to support it? And then you ask them, how can you help them in terms of making sure that this bill is passed or not passed?
So let's say an organization, we do that, and they say, yes, I'm going to vote for this bill because, it's good. And then we say, okay, great, I'm so glad you did. Why don't you come back to our organization and tell all of our residents about the bill and why you're going to support it?
That's great.
Would that count then as well as lobbying? What would that fall under if the representative then says, I'll do this, and this is how I'm going to, let your constituents know that I'm going to do it? That wouldn't be under that.
No, that would be great. But again, it's not an issue of whether you can or can't do it, because you can lobby. And it's actually a pretty significant amount of money that you can spend on lobbying, so the chances of you going over your limit is pretty slim. So if you're ever questioning, I would say just count it, because you're not going to go over it. So don't worry about what is and what isn't lobbying, because a lot of times people will try to think of, well, if I do this, then I don't have to count it as lobbying. And I don't want you to think about that. I want you to be aware of all the various different types of things that technically aren't lobbying, so that you don't have to worry about those types of things. But at the same time, I don't want you to be thinking, I'm not going to do something because it's lobbying, right? Yeah.
Are there specific guidelines between lobbying as an individual versus lobbying as an individual representing your organization? And is it simply as black and white as, for example, I call my legislator to tell them to support AmeriCorps funding, and I just say, hi, I'm Regina Pertushnik, as opposed to, hi, I'm Regina Pertushnik with the Detroit Public Schools Foundation. Is that basically just the difference?
Did you do it on staff time, or did you do it on company time? That's kind of the, the fine line. Yeah, you as individuals, it doesn't take away your First Amendment rights.
Right. Well, I'm just wondering, if
individuals,
they, if there's a specific guideline they follow, where, if you're at your office, then you're technically, on organizational time, or if you don't identify who you're with, then it's...
How do you define that? Let's say they recognize you as someone from this organization. How do you define that in terms of, this is just me, or do you have to just vocally say that? Or
just vocally say that, and then what you're doing, you're not doing it on company